So the day has finally arrived. AMD's RDNA 4, two new graphics cards, 9070 XT and 9070 non-XT, were revealed in full for the first time. And, well, what can I say? They promised quote-unquote aggressive pricing, and that's certainly what we've got. The 9070 non-XT, seemingly significantly more performant than NVIDIA's upcoming RTX 5070, and it's $550 MSRP. Obviously a huge asterisk in place, bearing in mind what's happening with MSRPs these days. But more to the point, a seemingly significantly even more capable card that's just $50 more, the XT model. All of which is very, very interesting. And the presentation was certainly confident and hugely impressive, I'd say. Oliver, I'm going to go to you first for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, first of all, with those two cards they laid out here, the 9070 and the 9070 XT, I think that differentiation is really interesting, like you mentioned, because in the surface, the 9070 is like really similar to the XT. It's really just that, on the hardware level, it's really just that cut down in CUs from 64 to 56 there. And there's also a big clock speed reduction, which is interesting, about a 450 megahertz odd clock speed reduction there. And then a big TDP reduction at 220 watts total board power there, I think. And the same memory interface and the same memory amount. I think the same memory speed as well. I think the bandwidth figures are the same there. It kind of reminds me a little bit, this is going back a ways, but it kind of reminds me a bit of the differentiation between the 7850 and 7870, where there was like a small-ish reduction in CU count for the 7850, but a big clock reduction. Like I think you're going from 1 gigahertz to 800 megahertz in the 7850 there. But if you did overclock that 7850, which had a lot of room to overclock, you could get it to 7870 performance. Indeed, that's what I did quite easily. You could get it to that higher bound of performance. You get it to like 1100 megahertz or so without too much difficulty usually. So I kind of wonder if the same could be true here. Now, there could be some power limits, there could be some voltage limits, etc. But both use two 8-pin connectors. So in theory, maybe that's the case, or maybe AIBs will have some room there to increase performance there, because it does seem like a little bit more of a software limitation here than a hardware limitation necessarily between those two cards. And the price differential doesn't make a whole lot of sense either, because for $50 more, you're getting a whole lot more performance, at least in theory. We'll have to see how that works out here, but that seems like it's the case here, and that seems like what AMD is signaling. One thing that I did note regarding those prices as well was when they cut to specific price numbers for the two cards, the audio sounded to me like it was recorded in a different space or with AI or something, an AI voice generation, because it sounds tonally completely different. It has a more artificial character to it. Now, I think that's just they were working on the prices until the last minute possible year.
Yep.
But yeah, we can talk more about the architectural side of things, but I think the two cards, just on a basic level, the performance they're specifying here, the kinds of improvements that they're going through architecturally, obviously, I think it's a really compelling offering, especially for that XT model, which looks like it's going to deliver, competitive performance with the 5070 Ti in a lot of respects, but for a lot less. Now, we'll have to see, of course. Everything we say here comes with a big caveat, because as we've seen recently, MSRP doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot in the context of retailers selling individual products and various supply shocks and tariffs and all these different factors, right? But if the pricing does end up being similar to this, then I think AMD has a real a set of cards here that's really quite compelling, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. The performance level of the cards, specifically the 9070 XT, is really, really exciting. I mean, AMD is quite open in saying that they're not quite as fast as the 5070 Ti with the XT, but then again, you look at the base sticker prices and there's a massive gulf between them, and they're saying you can overcome any particular gulf between the XT and the 5070 Ti with overclocking. All I would say on that is that obviously you can overclock the 5070 Ti as well. But the point is that, well, what can I say? Whether you're talking about minus 2% in gaming or plus 2% in gaming, to the user, it's basically the same thing. We're kind of very, very close to margin of error differentials there. You put the two cards side by side running the same things, and you will get a visually very, very similar result that I doubt many people will be able to tell the difference between. But I guess what you would be able to tell the difference between is stuff like the path tracing and multi-frame gen, that sort of thing, which I guess NVIDIA is going to be leaning into quite heavily on this. But John, I'm interested in your take on the whole presentation here, because you just watched it, right?
Yeah, I just watched it this morning, and I have to say it feels like a new generation of AMD, like a level of confidence that I don't feel like we've seen anytime recently. I mean, they've kind of made it clear that they're no longer targeting the Halo cards, the super high end, but I feel like what they've proposed here actually very much fits with what I would say a good percentage of PC gamers would be interested in, where it is the proposed performance targets. We don't have the numbers yet, obviously, here. They seem very, very aggressive and pretty capable for the types of games out there right now, and in line with where you would hope it would be. So like, it's not ultra high end, but it's high end enough. And maybe that's really where they need to get to. And when you combine this, so I'm looking at it from this perspective. I've been thinking about AMD more lately, specifically because of the CPU side of things, right? With Intel sort of stumbling, I've been thinking about the actual Ryzen CPUs and thinking maybe that's where I'm going to go next for my upgrades. But it always felt like the GPU side of AMD was trailing far behind and lacked that sort of confidence and swagger that the Ryzen team has shown. And it definitely feels like they're trying to take a step forward here and put down a flag in the sand and be like, this is the area that we're targeting with our GPUs now. And that very much fits a certain subset of customers. So I am happy to see that they're taking things like ray tracing more seriously, implementing sort of more machine learning elements into the FSR pipeline. They're making really positive steps in that regard. So I like to see that as well. The pricing stuff, as you said, I was actually pretty shocked by those prices, but we have to see how it shakes out in the real world, because it highlights one of the disappointing things is there's no actual reference design, which we kind of knew about, but like the fact that they show a fake reference design in the presentation, right, I found slightly odd, because that's a good looking card, right? Like the one they showed in the presentation many, many times. I like that design, and I feel like releasing that with that set target price would have been a smart play, but we'll see.
Oliver, you saw the XT at CES, right? When you did the FSR 4 demo. So was it a reference card, or was it some sort of third-party offshoot?
It was not the reference card, at least that they showed here. It did say it was an engineering sample. I presume then it was some variant of a third-party card. Although it was like not a particularly enticing design. I mean, we have some footage of it running over here, but I think you can tell it's not a super exciting design relative to this reference design, which who knows if that's an actual like real product that could be shipped, but it certainly does look quite compelling, I think.
I think, I think the issue with the reference design isn't so much the fact that, we quite like the look of it or whatever. It's the concept that reference cards are typically sold at MSRP. And there are no reference cards happening with either the 9070 or the XT. So the press have been seeded with, obviously, third-party cards, because there is no reference card. So the question is, what is it we're actually reviewing, and how much is it going to cost? That's questions that we kind of need answers to. And similarly, what are the price markups for that the third-party board manufacturers are going to put out there? What are the reference spec boards that you would expect to see at MSRP? I don't think we've had answers to that yet. So there's still big question marks over pricing here. And it's crucially important that there's clarification on this, because in the wake of the 5080 and the 5070 Ti launches, which were, a debacle, basically, everybody seems to be in it for themselves in getting as much money out of the consumer as possible, whether that's retailers upping the price of the cards, retailers adding cards into bundles of other equipment that you didn't really want to buy anyway, whether it's the AIB board people strapping on entirely inappropriate coolers that just give you like a single-digit percentage point boost in performance over reference spec. the whole thing needs a root and branch reform, in my opinion. And, I'm just really concerned that what's happened to NVIDIA is going to happen to AMD.
Especially with the XT side of things, right? As Oliver was surmising, like, yeah, the $50 price difference seems very small, right? But it feels like it could be ripe for these board manufacturers to sort of crank up that gap and introduce these
Right.
high-end XT versions that are significantly more. I mean, we don't know, but it feels like that's the kind of thing that could happen.
The thing is, the pricing that AMD has put out actually makes this really difficult because, obviously the third-party board manufacturers up prices by, producing more bespoke designs and, crazy, outrageous coolers. But the point is that I don't, if you've got a $50 price differential between the two cards, that basically means that there's a very strong possibility that a non-XT card could cost more, significantly more, than the MSRP of an XT card. And it's like, why would I want to spend that money when I could theoretically at least spend it on the XT model, which is more performant? It's all kind of a bit of a mess, to be honest, when price points are that compressed. But getting back to the show, which is, where there was genuine excitement there.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, AMD has kind of now finally embraced the concept of that machine learning is actually quite important. I mean, we've kind of known that pretty much since DLSS2 came along, but, we're there with AMD now. Secondly, ray tracing is now, a first-class citizen. It isn't a secondary concern, and it's not something that AMD is saying, you can tap into it if you want it. We've got it there. They're actually promoting it as a first-class citizen now. They were literally saying gamers want it. And this is like a massive turnaround, really, compared to prior messaging. So, in terms of features on the hardware level, seemingly they're there, which is great.
Yep.
Secondly, there's the software side of things and basically the vision of the future of gaming graphics, where NVIDIA has laid down, the foundations for what that is, which is to say neural rendering and, AI-driven features like upscaling and multi-frame generation. What can I say? AMD is obviously now taking that more seriously. We had a neural rendering demo. We saw something that looks like ray reconstruction. FSR4, obviously they're taking that a lot more seriously, to the point where they've kind of left behind this concept of a upscaling solution that works on all cards. They're now embracing the concept that they're going to need to actually use machine learning. I'm curious what you make of that, Oliver. It seems like a step change from AMD here.
Yeah. I mean, the machine learning performance does sound quite a lot better for what they've quoted here. And they have support for FP8 formats, which is quite important with acceleration there, in part because FSR4 sounds like it requires good FP8 acceleration. And so porting FSR4 to older cards might be a little bit challenging there. I know that's something that's come up in conversation, and AMD has mentioned that they're considering porting that to older cards, but it might not be possible there. In terms of the other aspects of the architecture, I mean, a lot of this stuff was disclosed when we talked back to Mark Cerny in terms of the ray tracing acceleration. They have a BVH8 acceleration. They're doubling the intersection engines. I think they have hardware stack management as well. They're quoting back a doubling of RT performance per CU, which makes a lot of sense here. I am curious about performance in games that use ray tracing, because I think performance should probably be, I mean, at least from what they've quoted, fairly competitive with NVIDIA in games that use lighter ray tracing. Now, games that use heavy ray tracing or path tracing, that's a bit more of a question mark. And then, of course, there's also just the weird benchmarking math of like, okay, where comparing these two cards, maybe using an equivalent workload, maybe with FSR, but in the real world, you'd never probably use these technologies without ray reconstruction on the NVIDIA side. So that's another factor that's a little bit confounding slightly. And then, of course, that gives NVIDIA a performance advantage because they have to use less denoising, and, potentially they can get a performance advantage there as well over the AMD solution. So yeah, I mean, that certainly is the case. But I actually think there is one interesting thing here, with respect to their machine learning performance and with respect to their ray tracing performance, because they did have a demo here, this Toy Shop demo, this revision of their 2005 Toy Shop demo effectively. And I actually think this shows some of the potential of the AMD hardware here in terms of performance, in terms of having a performant path tracing experience, but also some of the limitations in terms of the fact they don't have that stack of technologies there yet, because there was constant flickering and constant instability in that demo in both the reflections and the GI. It looked really messy, like Lumen at very low resolutions. And the scenes were fairly static as well, and yet you were getting a lot of like specular aliasing, a lot of just nastiness in that image. And then you get into the open world section, there's like a lot of ghosting on foliage, and the foliage looks really, really messy, even though it's only on screen for a few seconds there, you can really tell. So it's like, the rendering, looks good in some respects, but you're being distracted by that low quality image quality there. And they kind of need something like ray reconstruction. Now, Alex and I saw a demo of something that looked a lot like ray reconstruction at CES. It was not quite as effective in terms of delivering a stable, noise-free, sharp image. Now here, I don't know if they're using that necessarily. They are talking about using some kind of neural denoise or some kind of representation there. Perhaps that's what they're implying here. But relative to the NVIDIA solution, NVIDIA has kind of sketched out this landscape of solutions for rendering, in particular for heavy ray tracing titles, that actually does produce a markedly better image. And I think, especially if AMD is going to push into having competitive cards for techniques like path tracing, they need to get some of that stack in their software. I think they need to have some of that capability there, because this demo is really showing, like, even if you have the performance, you kind of need a solution like ray reconstruction to actually give you a saleable image.
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting that they brought up Project Amethyst, but no real meat on the bone there, right, Oliver? It was not... So you kind of wonder what's going on there.
It was just a one-off mention without even mentioning how it fits into their broader plans in terms of specific techniques or specific hardware. Obviously, maybe that's a ways out at this point, but I know there's a lot of controversy about PSSR and FSR, and that relationship, if any, was not really clarified for us, nor was anything else really clarified. It was a very brief mention.
Okay, so we're going to be going into the review period this upcoming week, and I'll be hopefully there on embargo with the details. But I'm looking at the sort of competitive landscape now, and AMD has priced very aggressively, I would say, and yeah, I mean, they're attacking on two fronts here. Basically, we can't really talk too much about the RTX 5070, but the specifications are out there and they're not particularly compelling. It seems to me that with the Blackwell launch, that with every successive card as we move down the stack, we're getting progressively fewer gains over the prior generation. And so, therefore, by extension, there's progressively less excitement about the product. And certainly looking at CUDA core count on 5070, along with the 12 gigs of memory, basically AMD is striking at the heart of the 70 series lineup here with a product that's got more memory. We assume it's going to have more performance. Obviously, that's going to be borne out. The question mark, I guess, is still going to be about how effective it is on ray tracing. It will have FSR4, but there's questions there in terms of its effectiveness against DLSS and certainly the transformer model. I would guess that NVIDIA is going to be leaning into, all of the accomplishments that are kind of less tangible, which I think is going to be a bit challenging for them. DLSS is a given. I think it's proven at this point that this is a desirable feature, and the transformer model is indeed transformative. I think the issue there that is, there's a lot of technologies that they do have which kind of get overlooked. Obviously AMD does have FSR3 frame generation, but it doesn't, only now has it got a reflex competitor, which would lower latency. And there's obviously software take-up. I mean, DLSS is far more established. There are many more titles, frame generation, many more titles. So in a sense, NVIDIA, I don't think they're going to be lowering prices on the 5070 because it sends out a signal that it is a weaker product. I don't think they want to do that. Instead, they're probably going to be talking about how great their software package is. And, there is stuff like Reflex that kind of flies under the radar. But they're up against it. What can I say? 12 gigs of memory up against 16. That's not great at the same price point, seemingly. I don't even know if we can actually talk about price points at this point until we actually see more stock for NVIDIA MSRP boards for the 5070, and the concept that we aren't going to get ripped off from the AMD side via the circumstances that mostly are outside of its control, such as the third-party board situation and the retail situation. So how this battle is going to stack up outside of potentially fictitious MSRPs is going to be quite interesting, I think. I think it's quite interesting that AMD did sort of target all of the strong points that NVIDIA is known for, and is kind of saying, right, we are a good alternative choice now. I think that's strong on its part and confident. The question is whether the package will actually hold up. And I guess for that, we'll just need to wait and see. But any final thoughts there, John?
I noticed near the end, they actually took a little bit of a shot at the power connector by stressing that most cards, as they say, will have the standard 8-pin power connector. Because I feel like that has kind of become a thorn in the NVIDIA side a little bit.
Right. I mean, the time for AMD to strike is now, because I think it's fair to say that the Blackwell launch has been, on the one hand, underwhelming in terms of performance and price improvements. And on the other hand, there's been a lot of things like, the black screen issue, the power connector issue, the missing ROPs. I have no idea how on earth that happened. The concept that ROPs were missing even on fully featured cards like the 5080. It's
so strange.
It's kind of baffling. I think I read that there are assurances it's not going to happen to the 5070, but this launch really does come across as being rather messy on the NVIDIA front. While it seems to me that AMD has kind of bided its time. They're talking about wide availability of the cards. We know that the stock has been in place with retailers for some time and presumably has been mounting in the background as well. So if ever there's a time for AMD to make an impact, it is now. And they are talking about 60 class products coming along for the even more affordable range of
going for Intel next.
There. I guess the one sort of statistic they're talking about, was it 85% of cards being sold under $750, which suits the particular narrative for the 9070 and 9070 XT. But how much of that 85% is actually beneath $500 or $400? So those budget cards are actually crucially important there. Obviously, it's always a 60 class NVIDIA product that inevitably sits at the top of the Steam hardware survey. So I suspect that's where volume really is. But, the stage has been set, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this all shakes out and what the ramifications are in future, because there has been the sense with NVIDIA that, they've had the market all to themselves. And I do think that, based on what we saw at that presentation, AMD has done practically everything they could do. I mean, that's good. God knows how much this is going to eat into their margins, that with that pricing.
We need competition like this. So this is great.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, but the price of the size of the chip, of the Navi 48 processor, it's not insignificant. It's significantly larger than the 5070s. They've somehow managed to get insane transistor density on that Navi 48 to bring that performance. So, they've really pushed out all the stops here, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it all shakes out in terms of final products.